The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty prairie as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her small cabin, wiping flour from her hands onto her worn apron. It was August of 1867, and the heat shimmered in waves across the endless grassland that stretched toward the horizon. Her husband had been gone for 3 days now, riding to the nearest settlement to trade their meager supply of buffalo hides for winter provisions. Sarah was alone, save for the chickens scratching in the dirt and the milk cow tethered near the creek. She walked toward the vegetable garden, such as it was, where scraggly tomato plants fought for survival against the relentless drought. That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost dismissed it as the wind rustling through the tall grass. But there it was again. A whimper, barely human, coming from somewhere beyond the garden fence. Sarah's heart began to pound. Every settler in this territory knew the dangers. Comanche raiders had struck homesteads up and down the frontier, and the stories that circulated at Sunday gatherings were enough to keep folks awake at night. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle she'd propped against the fence post, her fingers closing around the smooth wood. She stood perfectly still, listening, every muscle in her body tense as a drawn bowstring. The sound came again, weaker this time. It was coming from the creek bed, where cottonwood trees provided the only real shade for miles. Against every instinct screaming at her to return to the cabin and bolt the door, Sarah picked up her rifle and moved forward. Her boots made soft crunching sounds on the dry earth as she approached the creek bank, her eyes scanning the brush for any sign of movement. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. Lying in the shallow water, half hidden by overhanging branches, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, his copper skin streaked with dirt and blood. His long black hair was matted and tangled, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. But it was the arrow protruding from his shoulder that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Not a Comanche arrow. She recognized the fletching. Apache. This boy had been in a fight, and he'd lost. Sarah stood frozen, her rifle pointed at the unconscious child, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. This was a Comanche boy. His people had burned the Henderson farm just last spring, killing everyone inside. They'd taken Mary Peterson's daughter and she was never seen again. The Comanches were feared across the entire frontier, known as the finest horsemen and fiercest warriors on the plains. If she helped this boy, his people might see it as weakness. Or worse, they might come looking for him. But as she stood there, the boy's eyes fluttered open. They were dark as midnight, glazed with pain and fever, and they fixed on her with an intensity that pierced straight through her. He didn't cry out or try to move. He simply looked at her, this white woman with a rifle, and waited. In that moment, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. She saw her own son, the one she'd buried 2 winters ago when scarlet fever swept through the territory. She saw a child, hurt and alone, far from home and possibly dying. The rifle lowered before she'd even made a conscious decision. Sarah knelt beside the creek, setting her weapon aside, and reached toward the boy. He flinched but didn't pull away. His skin was burning with fever, and the wound in his shoulder had turned angry and red. If she didn't help him, he would die here in this creek bed, and buzzards would pick his bones clean before the week was out. Sarah made her choice. She slid her arms beneath the boy's thin body and lifted him, surprised at how light he was. His head lolled against her shoulder as she carried him toward the cabin, leaving a trail of water droplets in the dust. Behind her, the empty prairie stretched silent and vast, hiding secrets in its endless grass. She didn't know that 50 miles away, a Comanche war chief had discovered his son was missing, or that he was already gathering his warriors. She didn't know that her act of mercy would set in motion events that would change her life forever. All she knew was that a child needed help, and she was the only one who could give it. Sarah kicked the cabin door shut behind her and laid the boy on her own bed, the only real furniture in the single-room dwelling besides a table and 2 chairs. His eyes had closed again, and his breathing had become even more ragged. She'd tended to injured animals before, even helped birth her neighbor's baby once when the midwife couldn't get there in time, but this was different. This was a wound from violence, from warfare, and she wasn't sure she had the skill to save him. First things first. Sarah cut away the buckskin shirt he wore, exposing the arrow wound. The shaft had broken off, leaving only a few inches protruding from his shoulder. The flesh around it was swollen and hot, with red streaks beginning to creep down his arm. Blood poisoning, she thought grimly. She'd seen it before. If she didn't act fast, the infection would kill him faster than the wound itself. She heated water on the stove and gathered what supplies she had. Clean cloth torn from an old sheet. A bottle of whiskey her husband kept for medicinal purposes. A sharp knife that she held in the flames until the blade glowed. The boy's eyes opened again as she approached, and this time there was fear in them. He tried to speak, words in a language she didn't understand, his good arm coming up defensively. Sarah did something then that surprised even herself. She began to hum. It was an old hymn her mother used to sing, a gentle melody that seemed to fill the cabin with warmth. The boy's eyes fixed on her face, and slowly, his arm lowered. She showed him the cloth and the water, pantomiming what she needed to do, and though his jaw clenched tight, he gave her a single, slight nod. Removing the arrow was the worst part. Sarah had to cut deeper into the wound to get a grip on the arrowhead, and despite his obvious effort to remain silent, the boy's screams filled the cabin. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't fight her, didn't try to pull away. When the arrow finally came free, Sarah nearly wept with relief. She poured whiskey directly into the wound, and the boy's back arched off the bed, but still he didn't lash out at her. She stitched the wound closed with thread from her sewing kit, each stitch careful and precise. Then she bandaged it with clean cloth and stepped back, her hands shaking from the adrenaline. The boy had passed out again, his face pale beneath the copper of his skin. Sarah covered him with a quilt her grandmother had made and sat down heavily in her chair, suddenly exhausted. That first night, she didn't sleep. She kept a vigil beside the bed, changing his bandages when they soaked through, wiping his face with cool water when the fever raged highest. He spoke in his delirium, words she couldn't understand, sometimes calling out as if he were back in whatever battle had wounded him. Once, he opened his eyes and looked directly at her, and said something that sounded almost like a question. Sarah just shook her head gently and gave him water, holding the cup to his lips as he drank. The second day brought new challenges. The boy woke more fully, and the reality of his situation seemed to dawn on him. He was in the cabin of a white settler, injured and helpless, completely at her mercy. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes, the pride warring with the need for help. She made him broth from salt pork and wild onions, and after he eyed it suspiciously for several minutes, hunger won out and he ate. She tried to communicate through gestures and simple words. She pointed to herself and said, "Sarah." Then she pointed to him with a questioning look. He hesitated for a long moment, then tapped his chest and said something that sounded like Namkaru. She repeated it, and a ghost of something that might have been a smile touched his lips before pain wiped it away. Throughout the second day, Sarah kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see warriors materializing from the grass. Every time the chicken squawked or the cow lowed, her heart jumped into her throat. But the prairie remained empty, the horizon undisturbed. She wondered about the boy's family. Were they looking for him? Did they think he was dead? The thought of a mother somewhere, wondering about her lost son, made Sarah's chest tighten. By the third day, Namkaru's fever had broken. The infection hadn't spread, and the wound, while still angry and raw, showed signs of beginning to heal. He could sit up on his own now, though the movement clearly pained him. Sarah was changing his bandage when she noticed him watching her hands with intense focus, as if memorizing every movement she made. That afternoon, Sarah stepped outside to draw water from the well, and when she returned, she found Namkaru standing by the window, swaying slightly but upright. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than pain or fear in his expression. It might have been gratitude, or respect, or simply acknowledgement of the bond that forms between people when one saves another's life. She guided him back to the bed, and he went willingly, too weak still to stand for long. But as Sarah tucked the quilt around him again, she felt a shift in the air. Something had changed between them. They weren't just white woman and Comanche boy anymore. They were healer and patient. Maybe even something like friends. That night, Sarah finally allowed herself to sleep, exhausted to her bones. She dozed in her chair beside the bed, her rifle across her lap, as stars wheeled overhead and the prairie wind whispered secrets through the grass. She didn't hear the approach of horses in the darkness, didn't see the shadows that moved like smoke across the land. At dawn, she would wake to find everything changed forever. The first light of morning was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold when Sarah's eyes snapped open. She hadn't heard anything specific, but something had pulled her from sleep with the urgent insistence of pure instinct. The cabin was still dim, lit only by the dying embers in the stove. Namkaru was asleep in the bed, his breathing steady and even. Everything seemed peaceful, but Sarah's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. She stood slowly, quietly, and moved to the window. What she saw froze the blood in her veins. Warriors. At least 50 of them, sitting motionless on their horses in a semicircle around her cabin, silent as death itself. They had appeared as if they'd materialized from the earth itself, which in a way they had. Comanche warriors could move across the prairie like ghosts, and now they surrounded her home completely. There was no escape. In the center of the group sat a man who could only be their chief. He was older than the others, perhaps 40, with a face carved by years of sun and wind into something both beautiful and terrifying. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers, and across his chest hung a breastplate made of bone and beads. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the power in him, the absolute authority. His eyes were fixed on her cabin door with an intensity that made her stomach drop. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her rifle, then stopped. What good would one rifle do against 50 warriors? If they wanted her dead, she'd be dead before she could fire a second shot. She looked back at Namkaru, still sleeping peacefully, his young face relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. This was his father. That chief outside had come for his son. Her mind raced through possibilities. If she sent the boy out, would they simply take him and leave? Or would they kill her anyway, revenge for all the settlers who had killed their people? If she tried to hide him, to pretend he wasn't here, would they burn the cabin down around her? Every story she'd ever heard about Comanche raids flooded her memory, each one more horrifying than the last. The boy stirred and opened his eyes. He saw Sarah standing by the window, saw the expression on her face, and struggled to sit up. He followed her gaze and looked out the window himself. Sarah watched his face carefully, expecting to see relief, joy at seeing his people. Instead, she saw something more complex. Yes, there was happiness, but also worry, and something that looked almost like fear. Namkaru said something urgent in his language, gesturing toward the door and then toward her, his eyes wide. Sarah didn't need to understand the words to grasp the meaning. He was warning her. The situation was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than she'd realized. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him yet, and he sat back down heavily, frustration clear on his face. Sarah made a decision. She couldn't hide the boy, couldn't pretend he wasn't here. The only choice was to face what came next with whatever courage she could muster. She smoothed down her dress, checked that her hair was properly pinned, and walked to the door. Her hand rested on the latch for just a moment, and she took a deep breath. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the dawn light. The effect was immediate. Every warrior's hand moved to their weapon. Bows were partially drawn, lances lowered to point at her, rifles raised to shoulders. Sarah forced herself to stand still, her hands at her sides, palms open and visible. She looked directly at the chief, meeting his eyes with every ounce of bravery she possessed. For a long moment, nothing happened. The chief studied her with those dark, penetrating eyes, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her, could read every thought she'd ever had. His face was impassive, giving nothing away, but she noticed his jaw was clenched tight, the muscles jumping. This was a man holding himself under iron control, and Sarah realized with a chill that he was probably imagining what he would do to the person who had hurt his son. Then the chief spoke. His voice was deep and resonant, the words rolling out in a language that sounded both harsh and beautiful. He gestured toward the cabin, and the meaning was clear even without translation. He wanted his son. Sarah turned and called back into the cabin. Namkaru. She gestured for him to come out, to show himself. She heard movement inside, the scrape of the chair being used for support, and then the boy appeared in the doorway. The change in the chief was instantaneous. The iron mask of his face cracked, and something raw and powerful showed through. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion and strode toward the cabin. The warriors remained mounted but alert, watching every movement. When the chief reached his son, he stopped, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch him, afraid he might disappear. Namkaru spoke rapidly, gesturing to his bandaged shoulder, to Sarah, back to the cabin. The chief's eyes moved to Sarah, and she saw the question there, mixed with something she couldn't quite identify. His son spoke again, more urgently, and this time he stepped forward and took Sarah's hand, pulling her closer to his father. The chief looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Sarah's face. He said something in a tone that demanded an answer. Sarah had no idea what he was asking, but Namkaru responded, his voice strong despite his weakness. He pulled aside his shirt to show his father the carefully stitched wound, the clean bandages. He pantomimed Sarah removing the arrow, cleaning the wound, feeding him. His gestures were exaggerated but clear. The chief was silent for what felt like an eternity. The sun was climbing higher now, and the morning light fell across his face, highlighting every line and scar. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of debts and obligations, of honor and revenge. This was a man who led his people through one of the most difficult times in their history, watching as white settlers pushed further and further into their lands, killing their buffalo, driving them from their homes. She had no reason to expect mercy. Finally, the chief raised his hand, and every warrior straightened, ready to follow whatever command came next. Sarah's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was the moment. Whatever happened next would determine whether she lived or died, whether her husband would return to find a burned cabin and her body in the ashes. The chief's hand remained raised for a moment that stretched into infinity. Then slowly, deliberately, he lowered it to his chest and bowed his head slightly toward Sarah. It was a gesture of respect, unmistakable even across cultures. The tension that had been coiled in the air like a living thing suddenly released, and Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. The chief spoke again, his tone different now, softer but no less commanding. Two warriors dismounted and came forward, carrying what looked like a travois, a simple stretcher made of poles and hide that could be dragged behind a horse. They moved past Sarah without looking at her directly, their faces carefully neutral, and went to help Namkaru. The boy resisted at first, trying to walk on his own, but his father said something sharp and Namkaru reluctantly allowed himself to be helped onto the travois. As they brought the boy out, the chief reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something. He held it out to Sarah, and she automatically extended her hand. Into her palm, he placed a beautifully worked piece of turquoise, set in silver, hanging from a leather cord. It was the kind of craftsmanship that took months to complete, the stone polished until it gleamed like captured sky. Sarah looked up at him, questions in her eyes. The chief spoke, his words measured and deliberate. Though Sarah couldn't understand the language, she understood the meaning. This was payment, acknowledgement of the debt he owed her. But more than that, it was a promise. The way he looked at her, the gravity in his voice, told her something had shifted between her people and his, at least in this small corner of the vast prairie. Namkaru called out from the travois, and Sarah hurried over to him. He gripped her hand with surprising strength, his eyes intense. He spoke rapidly, urgently, and though she couldn't understand the words, she felt the emotion behind them. Gratitude, certainly, but also something more. A warning, perhaps? A promise? The boy reached up and touched the turquoise pendant his father had given her, then pointed to the horizon, then back to her cabin. He repeated the gesture several times until Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. The chief mounted his horse and gave a signal. The warriors began to turn their horses, the movement fluid and coordinated, decades of fighting together evident in how they moved as one unit. But before they left, the chief rode close to Sarah one final time. He looked at her cabin, at her garden, at the well and the small corral. Then he looked back at her and spoke a single word, repeated it 3 times, each time pointing at different landmarks around her property. His meaning was clear. This place was marked. This woman was protected. One of the younger warriors, a man with a scar across his cheek, said something that made several others grunt in agreement. The chief turned in his saddle and spoke sharply, his tone brooking no argument. The scarred warrior looked chastised but defiant, his eyes flickering toward Sarah with something that might have been resentment. The chief spoke again, longer this time, and gestured toward his son on the travois. Whatever he said made the warriors sit straighter, and even the scarred man's expression changed to something more respectful. Then they were moving, the entire party flowing across the prairie like water, the travois sliding smoothly behind one of the horses. Sarah stood in front of her cabin and watched them go, the turquoise pendant heavy in her hand. The sun was fully up now, and the day was already growing hot. In the distance, she could hear the chickens complaining about their delayed breakfast, and the cow needed milking. Life was returning to normal, except nothing was normal anymore. Sarah went back inside her cabin and sat down heavily in her chair. Her hands were shaking again, this time from the aftermath of fear rather than fear itself. She looked around at the small room that had been her whole world for the past 3 years. The bed where the boy had lain still bore the impression of his body. The bandages she'd used sat in a basket by the stove. The bowl she'd fed him from was on the table. Evidence of the past 3 days was everywhere. She fastened the turquoise pendant around her neck, feeling the cool stone rest against her skin. It felt like armor, like protection, and she found comfort in its weight. But she also felt the burden of what had happened. She'd crossed a line that most settlers wouldn't even approach. She'd helped the enemy, had shown compassion where most would show only fear and hatred. When her husband returned, what would she tell him? When the neighbors came calling, would they understand? Or would they see her as a traitor? The next several hours passed in a blur. Sarah went through her daily chores mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She milked the cow, fed the chickens, tended her struggling garden. But constantly, she found herself looking toward the horizon, half expecting to see warriors returning, though whether in gratitude or anger, she couldn't say. When the sun began its descent toward evening, Sarah heard the sound of a horse approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat until she recognized the rider. It was her husband, Tom, returning from his trading trip. He pulled up in front of the cabin, swinging down from his horse with the ease of long practice. But his smile faded when he saw her face. "Sarah? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Where did she even begin? Tom noticed the pendant around her neck, his eyes narrowing. "That's new. Where did you get it?" "Tom, something happened while you were gone. Something important. You need to sit down." Her husband's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, his eyes scanning the prairie. "Are you hurt? Did someone come here?" "The Comanche." "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "The Comanche came. But Tom, it's not what you think. Let me explain." As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah told her husband about the past 3 days. She told him about finding the wounded boy, about her decision to help him, about the warriors at dawn and the chief's gift. Tom listened in silence, his face growing increasingly troubled. When she finished, he stood and paced to the window, looking out at the darkening land. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice strained, "do you understand what you've done? When people hear about this, they're going to think you're sympathizing with the enemy. Some might even call it treason." "I saved a child's life," Sarah said firmly. "That's not treason. That's humanity." Tom turned to face her, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a good man, her husband, but he was also a practical man, and he understood the dangers of the frontier better than most. Maybe so. But not everyone will see it that way. The weeks that followed were harder than Sarah had anticipated. Tom, after his initial shock, had come to accept what she'd done, though he insisted they tell no one about the incident. The turquoise pendant stayed hidden under her dress, a secret she wore against her skin. Life returned to its rhythms of work and survival, but Sarah found herself changed in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She thought about Namkaru often, wondering if his wound was healing properly, if infection had set in later, if he'd survived the journey home. She wondered what he'd told his people about his time in her cabin, about the white woman who'd chosen to help rather than harm. Most of all, she wondered about his father, that fierce chief who'd shown mercy when he could have shown vengeance. Then, 6 weeks after the warriors had departed, Sarah woke to find something on her doorstep. A haunch of fresh venison, expertly butchered, wrapped in clean hide. No tracks led to or from the cabin. Whoever had left it had moved like smoke through the darkness. Sarah looked at the meat, then at the empty prairie, and felt her throat tighten with emotion. They hadn't forgotten. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time it was a bundle of beautifully tanned leather, soft as butter, worth more than anything Sarah could have afforded. Again, no tracks. No sign of who had left it. But Sarah knew. When Tom found it, he said nothing, just looked at his wife with an expression she couldn't quite read. The gifts continued sporadically over the next months. Dried berries and herbs. A finely made hunting knife. A basket woven so tightly it could hold water. Each time, Sarah would find them at dawn, and each time, she'd look toward the horizon and whisper her thanks to whoever might be listening. The gifts felt like more than payment. They felt like communication, like a conversation conducted in silence across the divide between two worlds. Winter came, harsh and brutal as Texas winters could be. Snow covered the prairie, and Sarah and Tom hunkered down in their cabin, living on their stored provisions. The wind howled like a living thing, and the cold crept through every crack in the walls. One particularly bitter night, Sarah heard something outside. Tom grabbed his rifle and opened the door cautiously. There, arranged in a windbreak around their cabin, were bundles of dried buffalo grass and wood. Enough fuel to last them through the worst of the winter. Once again, no tracks. Once again, the silent message, you are not forgotten. You are protected. Spring brought a thaw and with it, news from the other settlements. The Comanche had been active over the winter, but curiously, they'd avoided this section of the prairie entirely. Other farms had been raided, livestock taken, but Sarah and Tom's homestead remained untouched. When neighbors came to visit, they commented on it, suspicious and confused. How had the Mitchells been so lucky? Sarah said nothing about the boy or the warriors or the gifts. She kept her secret close, the turquoise pendant always hidden. But she could feel the neighbors' eyes on her, sense their unspoken questions. Tom grew increasingly uncomfortable with the attention, and one evening he suggested they might consider moving, finding a new place where their unusual fortune wouldn't mark them as different. "No," Sarah said firmly. "This is our home. We stay." She couldn't explain to him that leaving felt like breaking a promise, like rejecting the strange, fragile bridge that had been built between her and Namkaru's people. The gifts had stopped coming as regularly, but occasionally Sarah would still find small tokens. A perfect eagle feather. A handful of seeds from native plants. Each one felt precious, sacred even. Summer arrived with its blistering heat, and with it came a new challenge. A group of Texas Rangers rode through the territory, hunting for Comanche camps. They stopped at Sarah's cabin, demanding information, asking if she'd seen any signs of native activity. Sarah felt Tom's eyes on her as she answered truthfully that she'd seen nothing. The pendant felt like it was burning against her skin, but she kept her face calm. The ranger captain, a hard-faced man named Garrett, looked around the property with narrowed eyes. "You folks have been mighty lucky," he said. "Not a single raid. Not even a stolen chicken. Makes a man wonder." "Maybe we're just out of their way," Tom suggested, his voice steady. Garrett's eyes moved to Sarah. "Or maybe they got reason to leave you alone. That happens sometimes. People make deals, make arrangements with the savages." The last word was laden with contempt. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "We've made no deals, Captain. We're just trying to survive out here, same as everyone else." The Rangers left, but their visit cast a shadow over the homestead. Tom was angry, worried that suspicion would follow them. Sarah tried to reassure him, but she could feel the weight of her secret growing heavier. That night, she dreamed of Namkaru, his young face fever-bright, his eyes trusting as she tended his wound. She dreamed of his father, that powerful chief, bowing his head to her in respect. She woke with tears on her face. 2 years passed. The gifts became less frequent, then stopped entirely. Sarah told herself it was natural, that the debt had been paid, the obligation fulfilled. But she felt the loss keenly, like saying goodbye to a friend she'd never really known. Life continued its patterns. The garden grew. The chickens laid eggs. Tom built an addition onto the cabin. They endured. Then one autumn morning, Sarah stepped outside to find a young Comanche man standing by her well. She recognized him immediately, though he'd grown taller, broader, his face more mature. "Namkaru." He smiled when he saw her, a real smile that transformed his face. The scar from his wound was visible above the collar of his shirt, a reminder of where they'd begun. He didn't come closer, respecting the invisible boundary that separated their worlds. Instead, he placed something on the ground near the well, then mounted his horse with fluid grace. Before he rode away, he touched his hand to his chest, then extended it toward her. The same gesture his father had made. Respect. Gratitude. Farewell. Sarah waited until he was gone before walking to the well. There, carefully arranged, was a painted hide. On it, someone had depicted the story in images and symbols. A cabin. A woman. A boy with an arrow wound. Warriors on horses. And at the center, 2 hands clasped together, one pale, one dark. Below the image was a single word painted in English, crude but readable, friend. Sarah knelt in the dust, the painted hide in her hands, and let the tears come. Tom found her there some time later, and she showed him the hide without words. He looked at it for a long time, then at his wife's face, then at the horizon where the young warrior had disappeared. "You changed something," he said finally. "I don't know what exactly. But you changed something." Sarah nodded. She had changed something, though it was too small and too fragile to reshape the tide of history bearing down on the frontier. The conflict between settlers and native peoples would continue, would worsen, would end in tragedy and displacement. She knew that, understood it with the clarity of living through those times. But for one brief moment, in one small place, hatred had been answered with compassion, and that compassion had been honored. Years later, when Sarah was old and her children asked about the turquoise pendant she always wore and the painted hide that hung in their parlor, she told them the story. She told them about a wounded boy and his father's warriors at dawn, about the gifts left in darkness and the strange friendship forged across impossible divides. She told them that even in the darkest times, even when fear and hatred seemed to rule the world, there was always a choice. You could meet violence with violence, or you could offer mercy to a suffering child. "What happened to the boy?" her granddaughter asked. "To Namkaru?" Sarah looked out the window at the Texas prairie, still vast, still beautiful, but changed now, crisscrossed with roads and dotted with towns. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I hope he lived a long life. I hope he told his own children this story." I hope he remembered that not all white settlers were his enemies, just as his father showed me that not all Comanche were mine. She fingered the turquoise pendant, its surface worn smooth by decades of touch. We get to choose, she said softly. In the end, that's what matters most. Not the big battles or the sweep of history. Just the choices we make when faced with another person's suffering. I chose to help, and that choice changed everything. The painted hide still hangs in the descendants' homes today, a reminder that even in the midst of conflict and tragedy, moments of human connection can transcend the boundaries we draw between us. Sarah's story became legend in her family, passed down through generations, a testament to courage not of the battlefield, but of the heart. And somewhere, perhaps, in the memories of another family, on the opposite side of that long-ago conflict, a similar story is told about a brave boy and his wise father who chose honor over revenge. The prairie remembers. The land holds these stories in its vast silence, whispering them to those willing to listen. Sarah Mitchell chose compassion in a time of fear, and that choice rippled outward in ways she could never fully know, touching lives and changing hearts in the invisible web that connects all humanity. It was not enough to stop the tragedy that befell the Plains tribes. But it was enough to prove that another way was possible, that the cycle of violence could be broken, even if only briefly, even if only between one woman and one boy and one chief who valued his son's life above vengeance. That is the true story of she who sheltered a wounded Comanche boy, and of the 50 warriors who came at dawn not to destroy, but to honor a debt that transcended war.